and welcome. Welcome to the session, What is it to be cultured? My name is Ethan James and I'll be chairing it. What we want to look at this afternoon is really to what extent our kind of artistic and cultural activities are natural, and to what extent they need to or have been cultivated at different historical periods. It's quite a large subject, really, like many of these. We have a wonderful panel to talk about this with us. Speaking first, I'm Bill Cook, who is the Deputy Keeper and Head of previously the British Museum, and she's the curator of the exhibition on quite recently at the end called Ice Age Art, Arrivals of Modern Mind. And if you didn't see it, I'll give everyone a catalogue. So it's beautiful and inspiring. Speaking after Jill, we're here in Angus Kennedy, Angus is on my borough, and he's the head of external relations at the Institute of Library, and he's the convener of the Academy. He's author of Being Cultured in the Sense of Discrimination, which was highly relevant to this discussion. We'll then hear from Professor Ray Hallis, who is a Renaissance man. He's a fellow of the Academy of Writers, an author, philosopher, critic and poet. His recent books include NHS, SOS, and 18 Mankind, and is the chair of the Healthcare Professionals Society. And then we'll hear from Mark Hagel, who I hope I pronounced that correctly. Yes, Professor of Evolutionary Biology at the University of Reading. He's author of a book as well, very relevant to this session, called Wired for Culture, Origins of the Human Social Mind. I'll ask him to speak for about 5 minutes. We'll have a conversation between ourselves and then open it out to you. So, Jill, please begin.
Thank you. If anybody can't hear at the back, just give me a wave and I'll try and speak up. Right, you can't hear at the back. Better? Good. Okay. As Tiffany said, I work at the British Museum and I'm an archaeologist and a specialist in the archaeology of human evolution, with a very particular interest in the development of human cognition, where our brain begins to support minds which are capable of giving us culture. I'm very glad to be invited to speak at Battle of Ideas at the Institute of Ideas, because archaeologists don't often get this opportunity. The reason being is that we work on the material remains of the past in my field of people who don't write, don't build architecture, and don't do agriculture. They're all subsumed by this horrible Victorian word of Greek history, which in the main means that people can be deceived into believing that these people are not relevant to our deep past and where we come from. The reason we approached the Ice Age Art exhibition in the way we did was to dispel this myth, because it is in this deep past that the roots of our consciousness, of our minds, and of culture actually belong. When we approached the exhibition, we decided that we wouldn't do the normal archaeological things. We would look at this material, cave paintings, sculpture, engraved drawings on bone and stone, sculptures made from mammoth ivory, fantastic quantities of decorative ornaments in the context of art, and to display them as one would display art in a modern gallery, and indeed to add modern images to show that the concepts, techniques, perceptions were very much those that we are still using. We saw abstraction, we see realism, we see all the imagination that has been so vital to making humans the successful become. The art in the exhibition was not the world's oldest known art, but it is the world's oldest known figurative art. The oldest art begins in Southern Africa, over 100,000 years ago, where we find the evolution of anatomically modern people. So people who, from their skeletal remains, are exactly the same as us. But of course, from their skeletal remains, we can't tell how small. But already by 100,000 years ago, they are starting to do things, make decorations, to engrave rock surfaces, to use pigments in ways that suggest that they are doing things which are not related solely to the functions of survival, i.e. getting food and either keeping warm or protecting yourself from things that want to eat you. So they're doing things which are not simply about survival in the most basic form, but which become important in survival as your population grows. As these people move out of Africa and into Europe, they are anatomically ill-adapted to the very cold conditions of the late Ice Age, which they finally come up against. And it's at this point that we have an extraordinary development of cultural activities, of music, of evidence of dance, of many varied forms of art and imagination. And so it is here, really, that we must begin with the concept of culture. I think one of the things that the exhibition has thrown up, particularly in a couple of particularly tortured reviews, was that this is not the way in which we generally think about archaeological material. We're not often allowed to call it art. We are forced into calling things images and representations. And this comes from an 18th century notion of culture being about the Greek world and the body beautiful, and a rather Western and elitist concept which arrives to us from the Enlightenment. This is kind of a pity because my subject actually begins in the 18th century with the realization that the physical world is much older than had been thought, and the first beginnings of the notion of human antiquity. But the idea that culture is something that we do best is certainly still prevalent, as shown by some reactions to the exhibition. And I wonder there if we're not confusing culture with civilization. So I'll leave it at that, and we can come back to specific topics, perhaps arising from the exhibition, as we go along.
I suspect my role today is to be probably Victorian, Western and elitism. What might be even worse, sort of pre-Victorian, the Enlightenment. Because I'm going to start by arguing that I think culture is something quite rare, and I'm going to use the word culture in the high culture sense of art, philosophy, literature, music, sculpture and dance, as opposed to the more general anthropological sense of culture, of the way of life as a people. And I think it's important to restrict it from my argument to high culture sense, because the anthropological sense I find less interesting is because it's not really about something that you choose. It's more of a description of the way things are at any moment. It's not something I think that's really open to discussion or rational analysis. Culture, in the sense of the way things are, is something you are born into and kind of can only really hope to escape. Art is something to do with our hopes for that escape, I would argue. And I think probably obviously I disagree with the way Jill put it in finding our roots in the deep past. I think we find our roots in ourselves, in our freedom, by which I mean our ability to make history. It's just that I think history is a pretty recent invention and not a matter of the deep past, and it's something that hopefully lies more in front of us than behind. I also wanted to defend the idea that there's such a thing as high culture because I think it involves an important judgment that some works of art are better than some others. What I mean by that is that some works of art are more beautiful and more true than others, and what I mean by that is that they are more or less expressive of that human freedom and human spirit. And they've also survived for more or less time in a critical tradition. So we can be sort of more sure that the Iliad is beautiful and true because we've had it for a long time, compared to maybe Tracy, even whether or not she's in a tradition, I'm not quite sure. So I think beauty and truth are quite rare, because we are free but not in a free world. That has always been a circumstance of our existence. But I wanted to reach back to that Enlightenment period and start with a quote from the German poet and philosopher Friedrich Schiller, who wrote an important series of letters called On the Aesthetic Education of Man. And he said, "Art must abandon actuality and soar with becoming boldness above necessity, for art is the daughter of freedom and must receive her commission from the needs of spirits, not from the exigency of matter. But today, necessity is master and bends a degraded humanity beneath its tyrannous yoke." And Schiller thought that the frontiers of art were contracting in his time as the boundaries of science were enlarged. I don't want to predetermine what Mark might say, but I think he might prove to have been rather more prophetic than he could have feared. Now, I raise this by way of introduction to my argument because to try and answer the question of what it means to be cultured, I think we've got to take on the culture side of that question. We're not talking about what it means to be cultured in the sort of, what is it like to be a cultured person? Get up in the morning and read Dante, play the piano, read some German philosophy. We're really talking about what does it mean to be cultured, and what does culture consist, and how do we get more culture? And the immediate difficulty I think that this introduces is the difference, and Jill's not going to like this, between the historical and the prehistorical, between the cultured and the uncultured, the civilized and the savage. And I think there is an important and meaningful distinction to be made there that we're increasingly nervous about because we're scared of being accused of being Western and elitist and Victorian or worse. But we think we should try and hold on to that difference between the cultured and the uncultured, the cooked and the raw, if you like, because there have been important moments in history which have expressed that freedom in Athens, Rome, Florence, Enlightenment Europe. And I think Beethoven's Ninth, to pick one of the classical examples, is not meaningfully discussed alongside tom-toms or bone and ivory flutes or even peasant folk music. And I think that's because Beethoven's Ninth is classical music. And that means it exists within a tradition of music and it is timely rather than untimely or timeless. It has allowed itself over time to be compared with other music and so far has not been found wanting. So high culture, in the sense I'm using it then, is something that allows itself to be judged by other subjectivities through history. It's not objectively good in itself. I mean, if you read the score of Beethoven's Ninth over and over again, you won't find beauty. But its goodness is more than subjective. It's not just what you think, what you feel, because of the weight of argument that has accumulated through history in its favour. High or classical culture then, rather than considering itself above criticism because it is high, it was high precisely because it opened itself up to criticism. And I think that's where we get the defensiveness about elitism wrong. We say, oh, so-called high culture. And we've got how it got there, by being open through a tradition to criticism. So what am I doing with time? This is very short. 2 minutes. In this sense, I think classical high culture is not like prehistoric savage culture or non-traditional, pre-traditional culture, because the latter cannot admit or judgment or criticism, because it's rooted in a sort of full natural authority. It normally performs a ritual, functioning, expressible, a natural way of being, rather than the unnatural way of being, which is what we mean by culture, which we have always opposed to the idea of nature, in the same way that we see our freedom expressed when we do not allow ourselves to be determined by our natural instincts. If you simply do what feels right, you're not exercising your freedom. So freedom, cultural rationality exists in that space that's not natural. And I think we find that when we listen to very unnatural music, like Beethoven's Ninth, or look at the unnatural beauty of the painting. I think I might have the last one. If I've got a minute left, I threw in the wrong kind of pause, I think. Well, in that case, I'll leave it there.
Tiffany, thank you. The exam question is what is it to be cultured? And it's already clear from the contributions of my fellow panelists that this is not a simple question. There is profound ambiguity in the question, and I think it's teased out beautifully in Tiffany's blurb. And I want to just quote a few lines from the blurb. Culture has a wide range of meanings, from the anthropological sense of the culture of the people or nation, to the more restricted sense of high culture. You see the emphasis that Jill and Angus have made on those two respectively. And the tradition of Western high culture in particular. But however we understand the word, there continues to be debate about whether culture is primarily something done to you or something you acquire through your own efforts. And I think that's a beautiful way of presenting our theme today. I want to tease that out a bit further. Culture seems to be at once something you can't escape, in the sense you can't help sharing the knowledge, values, expectations, tastes, beliefs, artifacts, mapped out life course, world outlook of the social groups into which you are born or brought up in. So you can't escape it. At the same time, being cultured is something towards which you aspire and may never achieve. So in the few minutes assigned to me, I want to focus mainly on the latter, that is to say, on culture acquired deliberately through one's own efforts, or at least sought out, and then related to the culture in the broader sense. So hopefully it will bring about a rapprochement between Jill and Angus. And who knows, Mark may have a third position. Needless to say, I'm going to raise questions rather than give answers, so I'm sorry if you want your money back because I don't give you answers, you'll have to talk to Tiffany about this. But not only because of lack of time the opening remarks, but also because I don't think I know the answers, though I have some mighty strong prejudices, as indeed Angus and Jill do. Now the first question related to the issue of high culture versus low culture. It's been common amongst some academics paid to disseminate, promote or teach high culture to deny that there is any objective basis to this distinction. I think that's something that Angus was pushing against. This of course is entirely insincere. Critics who reject invalid criticism, for example, still write about John Donne rather than Pam Ayres and William Thackeray rather than Geoffrey Archer. Even so, those who believe that someone who reads Plotinus in the original Greek is more cultured than those who look to the popular press for philosophical enlightenment risk being dismissed as intellectual snobs. But even within high culture, there are bitter arguments over the canon of essential works, some that we heard yesterday at the battle. Does not the traditional canon, in which dead white European males predominate, reflect the hegemony of a certain cultural group, rather than the best that has been thought, said, painted and sung? The arguments continue. But even if we agree on the canon, the question then arises for how much of it we need to know from first hand to count as educated or cultured. I think I am reasonably well read, but what this boils down to is that I am only slightly less ill-read than most people. Now I once did a calculation, which I'll be happy to share with you, that demonstrates that in a life of normal duration, it would not be possible to jot through, never mind digest, reflect on and discuss, more than 0.5% of the books that have been described as essential reading, including the Iliad, and I would like to know how many people in this audience have read the Iliad. Answers on a piece of paper. Of course, we fool ourselves into thinking we've read more, listened to more, seen more than we have, because for every book, etc., we, as it were, have read personally, we read about many other hundreds of books. And then there's the first question. In what sense does our experience of literature, music, visual art add up? There are several responses to this, and none of them bear close examination. There is the idea of progressive enrichment, the idea of the well-stocked mind, the notion of a kind of spiritual loan created out of the sum total of your cultural experiences. In order to correct that, we need just to think how much of what we read, listened to, looked at, and so on, is available to us at any given time. And what is it available for? And this takes me from the question of cultural input to that of its consequences, and more speculatively to the relationship between culture in the narrow sense, high culture, and culture in the broad sense, the culture of everyday life, the culture explored by anthropologists. Now, buying into a culture, in the broad anthropological sense, is a necessary condition of being able to navigate the world, at the very least of steering one's way through it, and even flourishing it. This is the benign side of cultures. But there is another side of being cultured, namely unthinking prejudice, hostility to other cultures, the belief that however things are ordered in your culture, they are ordered for the best, and so on. And the heart of the notion of being cultured in the restricted sense of high culture is the idea of a heightened sensibility, of a wide and imaginative sympathy, and a reflective, even critical intelligence. This doesn't, of course, require omniscience or total retention to recall, but at the very least a willingness to open oneself to the new, which will foster further openness. So perhaps a cultured person in the narrow sense is one who's woken up, to some extent, out of everyday culture. Someone who is prepared not to take for granted all that is necessary sometimes taken for granted within that culture. Someone who has wide sympathies, who is able to take on new ideas without forgetting the old, has an intellectual temporal depth, and is aware of the necessary limitations of his or her own experience, knowledge, and understanding, and on their guard against their own stupidity and ignorance, ready all the time to kill the inner puppet. The puppet you necessarily have to have within you in order to function within a culture, in the anthropological sense, is able to kill the collective automaton within him or herself. So ultimately I think being high cultured is about living life abundantly within a culture, in the broad sense, in such a way as to promote, or not at least to hinder, the flourishing of others. Now, that's as far as I'm prepared to commit myself at present, namely that high culture is a necessary corrective to the simplifications that are necessary for our to function in the functional world. Now, I've not even touched on the relationship between culture and nature, and the question as to whether being cultured is natural, in the sense of being a biological characteristic of humans, belonging to what Karl Marx called our species being. Now, that may be because I published a 1,000-page trilogy in the early noughties on this very theme, published by Edinburgh University Press, and I've more recently followed up with another 500-page doorstopper. And I found it difficult to fit all that into my few minutes, which I see Tiffany offering up.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks all for coming. I feel that Tiffany framed this debate extraordinarily well. She said she wants to know whether culture is primarily something done to you or something you acquire through your own efforts. The trouble is, your very presence here sort of answers that question, doesn't it? Because you're all here trying to acquire culture through your own efforts rather than having it done to you. That's the trouble with London audiences. You all don't have anything better to do on a Sunday afternoon than come out and get cultured. And I think you've heard some really very disparate views of culture, and some of them are very clear and some of them are less clear. I think Angus has adopted a seductively sort of populist argument to argue for a very elitist theme, which is somehow that he and a few other people, maybe including Ray, I'm not sure, can decide what is high culture, and they want to introduce you to that high culture and drag you into it in a way that will somehow fulfill you in ways you couldn't possibly imagine on your own. They have equated themselves in some sense with Jill's arguments, which I think are actually very different. Jill is telling you that this cultural instinct has been with our species, human beings, modern humans, ever since our inception. And that's really what I want you to do. As an evolutionary biologist, I take a slightly longer time frame than just what you do on a Sunday afternoon. I want you to cast your minds back about 150 to 200,000 years ago to the advent of our species somewhere on the savannas of East Africa.
And what is coincident with that new species emerging, and in some sense is the actual indicator that we were a new species, is the advent of something we call culture. Now, what is culture? Well, if you look in the academic literature, there's something on the order of 165 different definitions of culture, which just shows you that, if you get 2 economists in a room, you get 3 opinions. So if you get 10 or 160 anthropologists in a room, you get thousands of opinions. But what everybody agrees on is that culture is something brand new in the field of evolution. What happened was, here was a species that came, and all of a sudden could transmit ideas, wisdom, knowledge, skills, and technology down the generations. No other species on Earth can do that. You take it utterly for granted, but it is something that transformed the world in ways no one could have anticipated 160,000 years ago. Because what this meant was that our species introduced a new kind of evolution, and this is idea evolution. Because now when ideas are transmitted down the generations, we can pick and choose the ideas that work, and as a result, ideas accumulate one on top of another, and unlike any other species, our cultures, the collection of all that wisdom and knowledge and skills and technology, our cultures progressively accumulate new stuff, new ideas, new technologies, and so on. So for example, 160,000 years ago, there were simple hand axes and there were simple clubs. Somebody had the idea to put a club together with a hand axe, and you get the first hafted axe. This progressive, cumulative, cultural adaptation is what allowed our species then to expand all around the world, because we could adapt our species at the cultural level rather than at the genetic level. And so before we came, bodies and genes changed faster than tools did, but when we came along, all of a sudden tools, our technology, our cultures started changing much more rapidly than our bodies. So this single species, all of you, moved around the entire world in a few tens of thousands of years, adapting at the cultural level to their local environments. And so, in a very, very profound sense, all of us owe our entire existence, we might say, to our culture happening to us. Because we were born into a culture that few of us had any understanding where the things come from, how the technologies work, where the wisdom came from, and yet we acquire that as a sort of cultural genome. The way we inherit our genes from our parents, we inherit a sort of cultural genome, which is the collective wisdom of our tribe. And so, in the most profound way I think you can imagine, and it's even more profound than you can imagine, and I'll give you an example in just a moment, you have had your culture, in some sense, inserted into your brain like a software operating system, into the hardware of your brain. And most of you, before you were even aware of concepts of culture and so on. So the languages you speak, the customs you follow, the beliefs you have, the rituals you have, the people you might fight or even kill in war are to a very, great extent, I don't want to say determined, but nearly determined by the culture into which you were born, over which you have very, very little control whatsoever. Now, you're all sitting there, trouble talking to modern humans. If you take all of this stuff for granted, you have no idea how profound it is in terms of shaping the world. 2 points I want to make is that, what am I talking about? I'm talking about making hand axes, and Angus and Ray are talking about the Iliad. Well, all of these artifacts of culture, the Iliad, Dante's Inferno, hand axes, iPhones, computers, all of these are human artifacts that had to compete in tournaments of selection by our minds. Probably when Homer wrote the Iliad, it wasn't the best seller, but it saw off all competition for 3,000 years, or whenever you think the Iliad was written, about 800 BC, because it probably was good. And now we regard it as a classic, but it's a classic because it saw off the competition. It wasn't a classic. There were probably lots of Homers around at the time Homer wrote the Iliad. Okay, I'm thinking one more time. Now, I'm going to pose one example to show you how profoundly your culture has shaped you. And I want you to bear in mind what I just said about cultural objects having to compete. How many of you know how to make popcorn? Put your hand up. Okay. Well, what do you start with when you make popcorn? You get the popping corn, right? Where do you get the popping corn? Well, you go down to Sainsbury's or Asda, don't you? But wait a minute. Somebody had to get that popping corn for you. Does anybody here know how to grow the corn to make popping corn? Oh, you do. You know the variety. You know how to strip the corn. Does anybody else? We got one lady here who knows how to do that. Well, now you get your corn, you can get it from her. You take it home, and now how do you make it into popped corn? Well, you put it in a pan, don't you, or a bowl, and then you put that bowl, if you're modern, unlike me, into a microwave. If you're old-fashioned, like me, you put it on the hob, right? But wait a minute, does anybody here know how to make a pan? Oh, she does, okay. Does anybody here know how to make a bowl out of glass? Does anybody know how to make a microwave? Does anybody know how to make a hob? No. Nobody here can make coffee. As simple as that. All of these things are things that you have inherited as part of your cultural genome. And so your cultures have happened to you in ways that you, I hope now, I want you to go through this in your mind over and over and over with other things, realize that in some respects, your culture is something that the little bits you're doing this afternoon, as enjoyable, as fulfilling as they are tiny little icings on the cake of your cultural genome. Thank you.
A quick response from the panel to each other. Ray, you were nodding and then I think this is Ray. Right.
Yes. I think Mark probably misunderstood a little bit. I think that both aspects of culture are totally valid. One is absolutely profound. It's a huge iceberg, below the surface. And that is the culture in which we are born, and it includes, of course, artifacts. It includes institutions, laws, norms, and ultimately, quite late developments, because language is a part of you, as you know, it includes things that have been written down, etc., etc. So that's one aspect of it. That's the anthropological culture that Jill was particularly exercised by. That doesn't in any way, I don't think, seriously compete with the kind of high culture we talk about, which enables you then to look critically and gratefully, I mean, you've invited us to be grateful for our ancestors and mine, but look critically and gratefully at one's culture in an anthropological sense. I don't think there's any competition there.
I guess it's not that we didn't start somewhere back in the midst of time. It's just that I can take and agree with the long history that Mark gives there, but I think that we end up somewhere that's not explainable anymore in terms of where we started. There becomes a great rift, a great discontinuity, and that's when freedom enters the world and it becomes necessity. So there is that very, very long tail when not very much happens, and then it's like the engine of history starts and happens, and then it sputters, and then it's out for a long time, and then it sputters again maybe in the Renaissance, and maybe it's sputtering again today. But it can speed up as there's that balance between freedom and necessity sometimes tips towards freedom. And when it does, we do things that make the world anew. Today, however, I think we're quite hostile to that idea of freedom, and we're ambivalent about the risks involved and the uncertainty that might be involved in projects to try and make the world anew. Because it's not just that sort of downward freedom feeling, it's not found just in the desire to find our determination in our genetics or our prehistory. You find it in Grace and Perry, for example, expressing the idea that we're determined by our class background, or by our very cultural identity determines our cultural identity. That there are these things that make us and do to us, rather than looking at the other way around, the culture as an expression of what we do in the world. The only other point I would add into that is that, Mark sort of challenged who am I to judge and, what's best. I certainly don't think I said that I wanted to drag you into it. I think my view of the value of high culture is that it comes when you take yourself to it. It wouldn't work if I sit here telling you mustn't play Beethoven's Night over and over again until you get that moment of transcendence. The only guarantee that comes is you won't get it. But if you self-start and take yourself to it, then it could have a positive impact. And I think that's because it comes out of a tradition, as I said in my introduction, which is about expressions of freedom that open themselves up to the freedom of others to criticise and judge what is being created. And I think there is something unique about the Western tradition in that sense as being more expressive of freedom. I mean, certainly it started by accident in the West, but once it got going, boy, did it get going. And that's why I think it is fair to say that some cultures are more culturally than other cultures. Yeah? Papua New Guinea is not rocking the boats on these things, and we just have to be aware of that. It's not because the West excluded it, right? It's because the Western tradition was open to assimilating other things.
Really slightly on that, because you can choose Papua New Guinea if you like, but you also have, of course, high cultures in China and South Asia, where music, sculpture, dance, all kinds of things are a high culture of those regions, and you also assuming that people who don't have this kind of high culture don't have history or culture at all, and that couldn't be further from the anthropological truth. However, I find myself not disagreeing with you hugely, because I am a participant and lover of this high culture. I'm curious about the word freedom, because I think what's interesting about the use of abstraction and various forms of imagination is that it is in the late 19th and 20th century when artists begin to break away from totalitarian systems of patronage and sponsorship, that we begin to see new ideas and impressionism, abstraction, and all kinds of things coming into our culture, which we haven't seen since the period from between 40 to 10,000 years ago, which is an interesting thought about what freedom means in this context. We do begin somewhere. It is something which we have to have the biological capacity for, and that depends on the evolution of our brains and the capacity to support minds and consciousness capable of all kinds of cultural expression. But finally, in response to in a slightly shorter version of the shorter definition that Angus used, I noted down Paul Clay's famous remark that art does not represent the visible, it makes things visible. And all cultures through all parts of the world do this. It's about making things visible, it's about symbolizing thought, it's about providing means of bonding and socializing. Now, whether you regard people as having high cultures or just culture, I don't think it really matters. Fundamentally, we're all doing basically the same thing from, as Mark says, the same biological position.
Whole new can of worms has just opened up. Thank you for your presentations. Can I see the microphone, please? So we've got quite a few. I'll take a few and then microphone person. So there's one person here. So yeah, so you could go stop.
Okay. Thank you. I've got an anthropological question, if that's okay, which is, I think maybe the panel doesn't really disagree with each other much if you accept that culture has levels. So you can have a determining culture and then a freely chosen culture. There's different culture 1, culture 2, if you like. But my question is, how did man transition from culture 1 to culture 2? By which institution? Because probably the best account I've got, I'm sure there's anthropological problems with it, is Emil Durkheim's Elementary Forms of Religious Life. And for him, religion was the mediating institution by which man transitioned from, if you like, a determined culture to a freely chosen culture.
Okay, get the mic back. Keep your hands up, that way I will make
a very crappy old laptop. It's about 4 years old, and it used to run Windows XP. I guess I'm using this to talk about this analogy between our brains and software. Because now my shitty laptop runs Windows 8. Nothing about the hardware has changed, but it does a marvelous job of things. Now, I guess to extend this analogy as a test, what I want to know is how did our operating systems rewrite themselves at a certain point in order to produce a situation in which they continue to rewrite the operating software. Right? Because this seems to be a bit of a fundamental flaw in the genetics analogy, which is that it's determined by inheritance. At which point the code becomes something which looks at itself.
It goes towards back to the man in the green shirt. Keep going. What? Stop.
It's on the subject of high culture, it seems to me one of the things high culture has is a sense of aspiration. That it's something that isn't that takes work to acquire or to get into. Whereas low culture, and I also it's slightly awkward to talk about culture as technology and culture as art. Because art is essentially useless except in its own terms, and it is fulfilling its own terms, but it doesn't help chop down the tree. But on the subject between low culture and high culture, there's a sense of aspiration that comes with high culture. Another thought that occurred to me was that sometimes you might not recognise what high culture is if you're not involved with the culture in which it occurs. For example, Papuan New now, it is entirely possible I don't know about Papuan culture. It is entirely possible it has within it a notion of high culture that if you're not in that culture, you don't appreciate what a great work of art is in the context of that culture. If you were embedded in that culture, it might look very different, and there might be a high culture there that we're not recognising.
There's a man with a basic cap. Wear a basic cap and get it.
That's why I wore part of my culture. Okay, I'm sorry if I don't stand up. I've hurt my knees, so I'll stand up as straight as I can. Apologies for that. So I wanted to tie together something that Ray Tallis said with maybe something that Mark, or perhaps both of them might be interested to comment on. It seems, listening to Mark, that maybe a simple answer to the question, at least one side of the question, what does it mean to be cultured? It means to be human. It doesn't seem that animals have culture in anything like the same sense. But there's an interesting finding that comes maybe from the last 30 years of some inquiry into psychology. An extraordinary thing, perhaps counterintuitive, is that when you make someone subconsciously aware of their own mortality, they become attached to their own cultural artifacts in an extraordinary way, and they become less willing to accept the cultural ideas, artifacts of other people. It may be that in some sense culture protects us, insulates us from the realization that we're mortal. We invest in building a structure that will survive us. Interestingly, when Mark said 200,000 years ago something happened, something did happen. We began to make more sophisticated tools, better utility. But in some sense, another thing happened with that intelligence, which was the awareness of our mortality, and hence culture, it seems, performs a function in that regard also.
Go towards the guy on the left at the end. Then I want one line really from the panel on what you think is most important, but really one of the second questions that come up that has come up is what's the driver of the change in history, I suppose, and therefore is there a distinction between previously and more recently in that respect? Yes.
I guess I'm requesting a little bit of clarity. There's two things here. There's like the origins of culture and the culture as it is developed, and where you can sort of see traditions of culture. This is kind of problematic because, well, for a start, the Enlightenment comes out of the end of the Renaissance. The Renaissance comes out of the medieval period. You know, no culture, developed or low, instantly springs out of all our collective foreheads, as it were. You can go back to the Iliad, and that comes from an oral culture.
we might have lost something of the poetry of how it was once spoken in ancient Greek, but we get something back from the writing and what writing can do for creating civilization. And then you go further back before the hand axe. I don't know what you think of this, but I take very seriously the idea that before our species, other species, the ones that we developed from, however you put it that, they could cook, they already had fire, and that is why we had great big heads, tiny stomachs, and relatively that size genitalia, because we were already capable of eating that sort of high energy cooked food. So in other words, the origin of a thing and what it develops in it seem very, very different things, and I just have a little clarification from all of your separate viewpoints of those. Thank you.
I think the first two questions about how do we get to culture two, the choosing of culture, and how do we rewrite our operating system, which is a question about when do we develop self-consciousness and self-awareness, or when does subjectivity start? Ancient Greece, Athens, and I think crudely, massively crudely, historically, two miracles happened. One, for the first time, democracy is let out of the bottle, and more people are allowed to judge the way things should be. More people are allowed to state what feels right to them. There's a recognition of the need to involve other perspectives on the world that happens in Egypt. And the second and fortuitous miracle is that these free Greeks speak Persian. And in doing so, which was entirely unexpected at the Battle of Salamis, in doing so, the material reality plays back their free subjectivity to them, and they start to become aware of their own freedom. Why did we beat this huge Persian navy? Because we were free men, and they start to explain their own freedom in terms of freedom, and so they demand more freedom. And what do? They start writing history. Right? And so that's when it starts. To add on to that, Jill said that this freedom thing is a curious word, and indeed it is. It's a most curious word. But she went on to say it's only recently that we've kind of broken away from patronage and power of elites. I would challenge that. I think there is slightly longer history of that. Socrates is one of our cultural expressions of somebody who theorized for us the idea that it was more important to be in self-agreement, myself, my reflective self with myself, when I ask myself, am I one? That was more important than to be in agreement with what society thought and convention. So he put that self-freedom absolutely at the heart of explaining to himself that we're going to be human to the extent that he was willing to die for it. Another example, I've got 1 second, or 30 seconds. A nice one is Michelangelo in the Renaissance. When he finished the Sistine Chapel, at least according to Vasari's life, the Pope would come along, Julius II, and repeatedly complain that it wasn't colourful enough, and he did a bit more embellishment, couldn't get a bit more gold and bright blue. And Michelangelo, interestingly, in this period, said no to the Pope, which is quite a brave thing to do if you think of the secular power of the papacy at this time. He said no very politely, but in doing so he expressed the value of history. He said, no, Holy Father, there should not be more embellishment in the chapel, because at the time of our Lord Jesus Christ, men could not wear grey.
I think very mixed emotions on Angus. Mixed emotions isn't what Angus has to say, because I share his, as it were, faith in Enlightenment values and the human being as an independent point of departure, etc., all of that I cherish and support. But I don't support his very tendentious intellectual history and the history of our cognitive architecture to as it were, support that. Our sense of self-consciousness must go further back than the Greeks. Although we have a particular angle on Western European culture that begins with the Greeks, and I've written about the miracle of pre-Socratic philosophy and so on, there's absolutely no doubt that must build on other things. And those other things go much, much, much further back. We're talking hundreds of thousands of years, by which time there's already been clear blue water between us and our nearest primate kin, the chimps or whatever. I spell it out in the last print, and indeed in detail in a 1,000-page trilogy on human consciousness. But you really can't say that, as it were, human consciousness, self-consciousness, freedom, etc., began in what is a mere blink of the eye ago in history. It's interesting in a way the debate between Jill and Angus is a bit like sort of Levi Rule being recycled by by Angus, and I don't think feels quite a Levi-Straussian, but I'm more sympathetic to Levi-Strauss. But one thing that I do feel sympathetic to Levi-Strauss is the acknowledgement that even in so-called primitive cultures with savage minds, there is an extraordinary complex cognitive architecture. That, of course, is the implicit ground floor, level 1 culture, quite different from the kind of other cultures we're talking about. Lots of other things to say about
When Picasso went into the Lascaux caves in southern France, where the paintings are about 17,000 years old, he was reduced to tears looking at the paintings, and he said, "We have invented nothing." And what he saw in those paintings was not a savage mind, not people who lacked empathy or insight, not people who were lacking in self-consciousness or consciousness. What he saw was people who were expressing the same kinds of emotions that he was kind of expressing in his own work that would follow along about 17,000 years later. Now this distinction between so-called level 1 culture and level 2 culture is just risen. It is the imposition by people in the present of values they think from the Enlightenment onto people that they think were savages 17,000, 50,000, 75,000, 150 or 200,000 years ago. Everything we know about modern humans suggests that their minds were more or less identical to ours from the outset. And one of the key features of human societies that all of you will take utterly for granted is an extraordinarily high level of cooperation among unrelated or distantly related people. Look at all of you sitting in this room right now, behaving remarkably well, cooperating. If this room was full of dogs or hyenas, I ask you to imagine what it would be like. We effortlessly behave this way, and we've been doing this, and this was one of our great inventions. This cooperation among unrelated people is incredibly cognitively complex. It requires social rules and instincts for getting along with people, for trading, exchanging, and so on. And so this Durkheimian view's got to go. It should have been replaced 25 years ago. And I think very, very few modern anthropologists and archaeologists still go back and read them for that.
Yes, I would agree with Margot quite a bit of that, and just add in that this is also someone spoke about aspiration, and I think aspiration is an important element of that bonding and cooperation, and using culture actually to go forward and develop the new software. British Museum is an Enlightenment museum, and it's one of the rare museums in the world where the remains of our most ancient ancestors are kept alongside those of high culture and the cultures of others. And I think rather than following the Enlightenment path that leads us to creating others, it is perhaps in a time of globalization and very rapidly changing cultures, perhaps time to think about what unites us as a species and how we came to that and what it offers us in terms of futures and ideas, and all our types of cultures combine to give us a future in that respect.
Thanks. Let's get some audience. Does anyone else defend her? And you're very welcome. Speak to sociology. There's a man in black.
It's going to be very impressive. I'm suspicious that three of you on the panel are celebrating the past to say that nothing has changed. I'm not going to say no. I'm just... Let me finish. Thank you. One thing we have learned is to listen. I'm with Angus here. I mean, just to take the example of the Iliad, Thersites in the Iliad basically says to Agamemnon, what we do in here, and he says no to kings and power and gets beaten to a pulp for it. Yeah, that's an origin, but it does seem that Angus is right, something different did happen in Athens. It was more social, more democratic, and more political. Right? And there are times when that sort of thing happens and it's different. Right? And high culture comes at those sort of times. Right? I just think that is. I know you're denying it. Right?
No, I'm
The
not
position of
denying it at all. I mean, I actually agree with you.
well, let me give you an example you used to. So, in this terrible global time, you said, right? And it's the idea that my thesis that you were going to say you don't. I do think, right, that behind this is the idea that we all get back to a primitive past, where all these creatures have been there through all time. Right? You know, the analogy with the genome is that it's all programs in your brains, not in society. But somehow we can all live if we get back to that sort of primitive culture. That is what I see. I go to the Enlightenment room and I see how the Enlightenment reinvented the Druids as sort of Greek characters. And we can see all that. But I think something is different is going on when you're stressing the similarities from the past and not stressing the differences. And I think there's a difference that need to be stressed.
Keep that thought, Joe, and everybody else. There's a woman in black and white just next to the man in black. And keep your hands up so I get you all in.
Okay, it's sort of continuing that point. I think the thing that really worries me about what most of the panelists are saying is the kind of lack of differentiation over historical periods, and the fact that the last 2,000 years, and possibly the last 500 years in particular, have seen incredible human achievements. And by taking history back to hundreds of thousands of years ago, you're almost implicitly diminishing those achievements. And I think that's the culture of the time, that there was a tendency to diminish the achievements of the last 500 years, and maybe back to the last 2,000 years or 3,000 years. And that I think is a very dangerous thing. It's sort of like we're losing a sense of the value of the importance of what humanity has achieved in a very, very, very short period of time, historically. So that's the main point I wanted to make, but I do think the other point I just want to make very quickly is I think we need to talk a little bit more about this idea of freedom and the importance of freedom and what is it that is we're free, the freedom of necessity from necessity. What that means in terms of our power to willfulness.
And there's a man behind you in red, a red t-shirt. And let me just check that for you.
Hello. I'm not going to deny the validity of saying that something has culture and has transcendence and alchemy, but I feel this concept of high culture can be very damaging and very dangerous because it can deny that something profound can come from anywhere. I mean, you made a little jip about Papua New Guinea, but holding on to this idea of what is established, and this is what you're actually talking about when you're talking about the Iliad and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, prevents you from perhaps appreciating what is profound and what is transcendent and what is alchemical in something new and where culture may go. And I think it's very important to perhaps acknowledge that no one here will actually judge what high culture is. It will be history that will judge what high culture is. And it may very well be, in 1,000 years, that high culture will be a video game, or a comic, or something else equally wonderful. I just feel like we're holding on to a very specific concept of what culture is.
In the days of the British Empire, Lord Badminton saw two of his Indian servants with two rackets hit a ball which was fixed to feathers. He later introduced a game that he named after him, badminton, which was actually derived from this Indian sport. I believe it was called putt-putt. Also, around rugby, in England it's become a public school sport, and even in terms of like what we wear. My question is, do you accept that there's been like an appropriation of low culture by the upper classes? And if so, how could you explain this?
wouldn't call it peach. I'd like to go off on a tangent. I'm very interested in this idea of the archaeology of culture, and I was struck by something Jill said. I think she said that if we could go back 200,000 years, we'd see people who look very similar to us, and yet haven't yet reached liftoff culturally. Behavioural scientists, as I understand it, are talking with increasing confidence about other species having culture, or showing signs of culture: elephants, chimpanzees, dolphins, crows. I just wondered how you feel about the fact that the human species seems to be on the brink of actually exterminating these other species just at the point where they may be about to reach, approaching some kind of liftoff. Or does it only matter that we're cultured and nothing goes back?
There's a man up there, and if anything on one line, that they're allowing it.
I hope everyone will forgive me for the incredibly imprecise way in which I'm going to express what I'm going to try and express. But I think there's, an attempt to be said, there's perhaps a slight mix-up which is allowing some of the panelists to seem like there's less disagreement than perhaps there is. I think that's that they're mixing up two ideas of freedom. I think that lots of people agree that culture is a sort of expression of freedom, even if it's just freedom to scribble on the cave wall. And I think there's sort of two ideas of freedom that's playing. One is what might tend to be called like self-conscious freedom, the ability to make choices, and that clearly has a long history of as soon as like 300,000 years, however long human beings have been around. Then the second type is a very distinctive type of freedom that does perhaps enter the world in ancient Greece, which is more expressive, subjective freedom, the ability for people as not just individuals but as societies to do things that are totally free from necessity. If that's the kind of freedom we need, then the only kind of culture that is truly culture, if culture is freedom, is the high culture. But then that in itself presents a problem, because I don't think that high culture is truly free in that second sense, because it still expresses the fundamental desire that we can't escape from, which is the fear of death, and that culture wants to be the security and survival mortality. So to say culture is freedom is to say sort of right if we're talking about the second sense, but is not the whole story.
One line.
I'll respond to everyone, but I think you want to respond to the gentleman in black, whom I'll call Dennis, just for the sake of it. And I feel like the Pope being accused of being an atheist. As far as I'm concerned, I am very much subscribed to the notion we've made huge and spectacular progress. I wrote another bloody doorstopper, 500-page book called Enemies of Hope, which was a critique of the German Enlightenment. And I totally agree with you to reject the notion we've made huge progress at an accelerating, in all respects, the way we treat each other, some horrible lapses and so on, our technology, etc. To overlook that is just absurd. And I am an optimist as well. So, I'm a Pope called the atheist. But I think what you're muddling in what I'm saying, or perhaps I'm expressing a muddled way, it's a long line, it's gone around the equator twice, but was the difference between, as it were, the cognitive structures that opened up this huge gap between us and our nearest primary cousins, chimps or whatever, and the much more recent developments over the last 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 10,000 years. I think we keep those two things separate and then realise we're talking from the same page.
Which one to choose?
Do you have one more chance after this to come back and
Mr. Pink did quite a little work for me, so I'll pick up perhaps on just a comment I wanted to make that, in a sense, a lot of the high cultures we're talking about are rather like racial characteristics. They're the consequence of geographical isolation and inward looking. And as the world has become more capable of faster transmission of ideas, we are, in a sense, losing those high cultures and developing into quite a different cultural norm. So I think we are on a point of change, and that's not devaluing 500 years of achievement. That 500 years of achievement actually has given us the capacity to understand the complexity of the human past, and what I want to try and break is the fact that in some respects holding on to 18th century ideas when they didn't know then what we know now doesn't quite make sense.
Well, I think ideas don't sort of pass their sell-by date. Good ideas are good ideas, whether they came from the 18th century or the 5th century, I don't really mind. I just, in defence of Durkheim, I think that our cooperation is based on what we have in common, yes. What we have in common is our free will and our reason. And what is unique is our meat rather than our spirit. Right? Your brains are unique, your bodies are unique, and they are, they're not shared, they're your own, and they'll go with you. Whereas your mind and your spirit is something that interacts with others. I would defend more of a concept of a shared mind in that sense. So I think our ability to sit here and listen to me speak on about this is based on what we have in common, which is our freedom and reason, not what we do not have in common, which is our material sense. So it's our active abilities as human beings which allow us to come together rather than our passivity of being in the world as its flesh. And it's that I think allows us to recognise spirit in the world, which is why you can assimilate into a Western tradition where you find expressions of freedoms in other traditions. Classical music has done lots of this historically. It's not defined itself by opposition to Babylonian Indian music or Chinese music, but it has taken things into it. It does it affords the greatest possible favour and respect to different spirit when it finds it in different cultures by lifting it up into that tradition where it's something that we can all then share.
Just a very quick comment. There seems to be a lot of fans of the Enlightenment here, and that's a good thing because the Enlightenment is a good thing. But you do have to understand that it was really an escape from tyranny. And if you talk to people in the Enlightenment, they would have told you that they drew a lot of their ideas from ideas about 1,500 years before them from ancient Greece. And if you talk to the ancient Greeks, they would have told you that they got a lot of their ideas by oral tradition, which is why you don't know about them, because they're not written down in any fossilized way. So we shouldn't be chauvinistic about the present. We've achieved an enormous amount in our morality and our sensitivity to differences and so on. All of these things are evolving and improving. That's not to say that in the past they didn't exist. And one of the things you should be aware of is that primitive sort of indigenous peoples, hunter-gatherers, people who are still living a Stone Age existence, for example, in parts of Africa or in the Amazonian rainforest, have sophisticated systems of morality, exchange, and above all, egalitarianism. They're true democrats. They don't have leaders. They don't have presidents and kings. Those things are relatively recent, 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, and they created a lot of trouble. But among those people, egalitarianism rules and democracy rules. So we shouldn't be chauvinistic about our relatively recent past. It's just written down, so we think we invented it.
Yeah, I just had a few thoughts about the terminology of this discussion. So it seems like, well, maybe all of the panelists and quite a lot of the audience members are mostly using different definitions of the word culture, using this, and this word seems kind of quite overstretched. And I wonder if maybe it would be easier to have this discussion, say, in a different language, which may or may not have different terms for these different aspects of culture. That might make it easier to discuss this issue. And also, this term high culture, for me at least, it carries kind of inescapable connotations of kind of, for want of a better word, upper class, judgmental, sanctimonious attitudes of kind of, we know better than you, this is what is improving to you. And it's really hard to use that term and get away from those associations for me. So maybe it would be better, it would be easier to have a more rational conversation about this if there was another term for that.
Okay. I've got man in black here, lady down here, and then I think that's probably it. So panel, oh, and a man in the room there, and we'll go last. Let's see how we'll have their final remarks. Yes, you've been very patient.
I grew up in Swansea South Wales, which was described in an early planning guidelines as the UK's Astro culture. And in my summers, I would work just outside Swansea in the countryside in a 5-star 2A Rosette restaurant with an award-winning wine cellar. And I'll never forget one evening this Welsh couple in the 50s came in. I take their coats and I sit them down and I asked them if they like to drink, and the gentleman was like, I love a lager. And then I go to the woman, and what would you like to drink? She goes, just a glass of wine, please. And I say, well, do you like red or white? And she goes, oh, I don't mind, I don't mind. And what's saying with that is, even though most people here would say that, they're not cultured. And even I would say that they're not making the most of being in a high cultured environment. They felt that they were, and they had a really nice evening, and they had probably a better evening than the American couple at the bottle of Chat and Margaux at the next table.
I wasn't actually going to ask a question, but I was really struck by what Mark said about we should be chauvinistic and about oral cultures of the past. And obviously, I think that's quite right. We shouldn't, dismiss those cultures. I'm using it in the anthropological sense. But I was struck by your eagerness to suggest that there was no real break between an oral culture and a written culture. With a written culture, I would suggest or imagine or like to explore that there is the birth of abstract thought, abstract concepts. You can argue that you cannot have philosophy, you cannot have self-reflective abstract concepts, conceits within oral culture. That's allowed, those abstraction has been allowed, has developed solely because of a written culture. So there is I would suggest there was a distinct break culturally between an oral and a written culture. And that's about the development of abstract ideas.
Well, I think I very much agree with that last point, but maybe to add to that a little, Professor Callis' point about, our cognitive structure remains with us throughout the period of the non-human existence. That seems strange to me because I always tend to use a simple analogy maybe. Imagine somebody standing on the white cliffs of Dover 15,000 years ago, What do they see? What do they look out upon? What do they gaze upon? And to me, they probably gaze upon an insuperable barrier to any further travel. You can build up a whole host of ideas about what might be in the consciousness of such an individual. But 10,000 years later, the person looks out with a very different consciousness because man has, done something to the world and has changed the world, and therefore so doing has changed his own consciousness. And this kind of idea of cognitive structure running back into the deep history sort of denies the process that actually human beings' consciousness, their cognitive structure changes, significantly. And, as Angus has said, at the time of the Greeks, it is a kind of, huge leap forward that takes place in that sort of cognitive structure.
It's a very large discussion, as you will know. So what I want the panel to do is sum up in one sentence or two sentences each. This is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. So Jill, please begin.
I've got the impossible task of beginning. Abstraction certainly does exist before writing, and we see this in the art of the period of 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, where we have imaginary beings and abstractions of the human form. Mind is capable of abstraction, of numeracy, and of symbolizing in ways. I could cite you an example of a Southwest African tribe who, in material terms, would leave nothing for an archaeologist to detect. but their oral traditions, their history, their poetry, their proverbs, their ethical code were recorded in writing by a German missionary in both of their own languages and German, and shows very much that these people that we tend to disregard as others are very much like us in the approach to life.
Well, just two things. I mean, to pick up on my interest in intellectual history, I think there is a big break between the oral and the written culture. History started with writing in Athens, because before that there wasn't anything worth writing down. It was timeless other than timely. It was the birth of history that necessitated writing to develop, to capture it. If you read the Iliad carefully, you will observe a complete lack of psychological depth in its characters. Compare it to the Aeneid some 700 years later, where the inner conflict of Aeneas, his sense of duty and his mission, and the hold against his nature, love for Dido, comes to the fore. That is not there. It's not there in the Iliad. It's not there in Greek geometric art, where man is just a bunch of muscles, as opposed to Redford painting in the 5th century BC, where people start to be shown us in perspective, looking at us stepping out of the frame in the way that actors stepped out of the chorus line in Athenian drama. I'll end with a bit more of Schiller, who says that nature is only a starting point. Against nature, our humanity consists in not being satisfied with that starting point. Our humanity consists in remodeling the work of necessity into a work of our own free choice, and of elevating physical into moral necessity.
Just to address, first of all, this amazing rupture of epistemology that took place, at the time of the pre-Socratic philosophers, and of course that was the most important change in human consciousness, and there are lots of reasons for that. Angus has mentioned the political context, the dialogic culture, writing was perfected in the alphabet, cognitive density of cities, and also colonialism, where people had, as trade, where people had to engage with people in speaking other languages, but as equals. All of those things may explain extraordinary rupture epistemology that took place. But all of those things are based on what has gone before. And we're not actually standing on the shoulders of giants. We're standing, if you like, on many millions and millions of people who have created the community of minds in which these great changes can take place. So I can reconcile, if you like, the notion of particular progress with an idea that behind that are some pretty stable or some pretty ancient cognitive structures that distance us massively from our nearest primate kin, like chimpanzees.
I don't have a whole lot to add to what the three have just said, other than to be open-minded. And if you think that your ancestors were savages, I suggest you go over to the British Museum. And Joe, is the exhibition still on? No. But or get hold of Jill's book and have a really close look at the art and the artifacts in that book, and see if you can convince yourself that these people didn't have what we would consider to be modern Enlightenment sensibilities. As for things like the Iliad and lacking psychological depth, I don't know, read the Iliad. When Odysseus gets back and he meets his son, these are pretty poignant moments. And when he goes back to Penelope,
That's the Odyssey.
and she, and just but just to be clear, this was an oral tradition. It wasn't written down. So I mean, I think we've got to be. Well, it wasn't eventually, but it was passed on. Well, no, it was passed on by oral tradition, and then people long after Homer wrote it down, not Homer.
The oral tradition began to then BC.
That's a conversation that will continue. But before then, please join me in thanking our panel.